we are going to continue straight away with Irene G, Professor G, and her discussion is going to be Nickolay Gantchev. Now, Irene has written a paper titled, "Which Firms Require More Governance? Evidence from Mutual Funds Reveal Preference." So another empirical paper. Irene is a professor of finance at the University of Toronto. Her commentator will be Professor Nickolay Gantchev from the University of Warwick, also a professor of finance. Irene, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Horst, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I would first like to thank the organizers for including this paper in the program. And thank you, everyone, for joining the presentation. So this project is about mutual funds preferences as reflected in their votes. So I think it should be a nice contrast to, and perhaps a sequel to, Alain's presentation. So in this paper, I estimate whether mutual funds are more enthusiastic about governance changes at some companies compared to others. And this is an early project, and I'm just starting to collect initial feedback. So, and I think the paper can go in several different directions. So I'm very much looking forward to next discussion, as well as the reaction from the audience. Okay, so mutual funds own a substantial portion of the stock of US companies. And if anything, their significance has been increasing over time. And mutual funds are required to vote on all management and shareholder proposals. So they have substantial power to change their portfolio companies' policies, governance, and value through their votes on proposals. And proposal topics include voting rules, election procedures, board composition, political contribution, and environmental and social issues. And the merit of these topics are at the center of corporate governance research. It has been so for decades, as we all know. And ESG topics are gaining more interest these days. So we want to have a good understanding of what makes mutual funds vote for or against their portfolio companies' proposals. So given the importance of this question has been studied from many different angles by many respected scholars, and that includes many of you in this room. So I guess the most intuitive answer to the question of what explains fund vote is funds vote for proposals that increase firm value, and they vote against proposals that decrease firm value, because they care about the value of their portfolio companies. And also mutual funds have the fiduciary duty to vote in ways that maximize their client interests. However, once we start to look at the reality, funds are required to vote on hundreds of companies, thousands of proposals each year. So it might not be possible to make informed decisions on all the proposals they vote on. So the literature shows that proxy advisors' voting recommendation can have a significant impact on fund vote, as well as aggregate voting outcomes. And funds have also been criticized for voting in the same manner for all of their portfolio companies' proposal on a given agenda without considering whether the proposal is a good idea for the firm that received the proposal. And such voting pattern is referred to as a one-size-fits-all approach. And you see some of the other key determinants in this slide as well. And what I believe is not so obvious in this scene is whether funds take into account who received the proposal. So from a big picture perspective, the meta question is whether the company that received the proposal would benefit from changing their governance structure in the proposed direction. And if we think that one-size-fits-all approach is problematic, and if we believe that some companies can benefit more from separating the CEO and the chairman of the board, then mutual funds can potentially take the relative merits into account in their voting decisions by voting for some companies' independent board chairman proposals and voting against other companies' independent board chairman. So in this paper, I'm going to bring companies to the forefront of the analysis. So I do so by examining how mutual funds vote differently across their portfolio firm shareholder proposal on a particular topic, and by using the revealed preference argument to elicit fund preferences. So I aggregate the preferences of mutual funds to estimate their consensus using a recent machine learning technique, and I develop mutual funds preference rankings across companies. And with the rankings I develop in this paper, I will be able to estimate something like whether mutual funds prefer American Airlines to separate the CEO and the chairman of the board relative to Southwest, and whether the difference is meaningful statistically. So this is a useful exercise because there's an ongoing policy discussion on mutual funds proxy voting policies and what the role of proxy advisors should be in the voting scene. So we want to have a good understanding of funds preferences and their voting behavior before we design any policies. And firms that are trying to improve shareholder support will want to know how they're viewed by institutional shareholders relative to comparable firms or firms that receive the same type of proposal. And with the rankings I develop in this paper, I can examine whether funds value firm attributes such as existing governance in place, firm performance, and life cycle stage that are believed to be important in determining companies' optimal governance structures. And over the next few slides, I will explain how I estimate mutual funds preferences. So for now, let's suppose that there is one mutual fund, which we call Fund A, that voted on McDonald's and ConocoPhillips proxy access proposals around the same time. And also, let's assume that the fund voted for McDonald's proxy access proposal and voted against ConocoPhillips proxy access proposal. So according to the revealed preference argument, we can infer that Fund A prefers McDonald's to allow proxy access compared to ConocoPhillips. So this illustrates the pairwise preference of a single fund. And because there are multiple mutual funds that voted on these two firms' proposals, and there are many more firms that receive the same type of, many more companies that receive the same type of proposal in the same year. Let me now show you in the next slide how we can make an inference when there are more funds and more companies. So the figure you see on the left shows the number of mutual funds that owned one or more of these three companies in a given year. So it shows that 279 funds owned all three companies and 122 owned ConocoPhillips and McDonald's, but not Citigroup. And the figure you see on the right shows that it seems like funds prefer Citigroup to implement proxy access compared to McDonald's, and they also prefer McDonald's to implement proxy access compared to ConocoPhillips. So using the revealed preference argument again, it seems like proxy access would be most preferred at Citi, followed by McDonald's and ConocoPhillips. So you can see where this is leading to. So I'm going to develop preference rankings like this for all firms that receive the same type of proposal in the same year. So the figure you see in the slide shows the pattern when there are many mutual funds and many companies. So it displays how 50 mutual funds voted on 20 firms' proxy access proposal in 2015. So each column displays a firm and each row shows how each fund voted on its portfolio firm's proxy access proposal in 2015. And here green means for and red means against, and light gray means no vote. It's mostly likely because the fund did not own the company. So what you can see here is that some companies happen to receive a for vote from a mutual fund that voted against most of their portfolio companies' proposal. And other companies happen to receive an against vote from a fund that almost always voted for proxy access proposals. So this tells us that mutual funds prefer some companies to allow proxy access compared to others. And I'm going to construct a ranking across companies using this pattern. Okay, so far I wanted to give you an idea, the main intuition, and now let me briefly talk about how I actually estimate preferences and how I actually develop rankings. So I'm going to rely on the Mallows model, and the Mallows model assumes that there's a true ranking and the probability of observing a particular ranking in the data decreases exponentially as the distance between the observed ranking and the true ranking becomes larger. So the equation you see in this slide might not be straightforward at first, but the intuition is very straightforward and simple. So it's like if there are 3 fruits to be ranked, apple, banana, and cherry, and if apple is the most preferred fruit, and if cherry is the least preferred fruit, then the probability of someone saying I prefer apple to banana and banana to cherry is higher than someone saying I prefer cherry to banana and banana to apple. So the intuition is very simple. So assuming that the data are generated according to this Mallows model, the goal in the Bayesian framework is to estimate the posterior distribution of the key parameters given the data. So the goal here is to estimate rho, which is the true ranking, using the data on mutual funds preferences as reflected in their vote. So I'm going to observe individual funds preferences, and using this information, I will estimate the posterior distribution of the true rankings, as well as alpha, which measures the degree of consensus among the funds. So there are several obstacles to directly estimating the key parameters. So the most important one is the numerical overflow. So if there are n firms to be ranked, then the number of possible rankings is n factorial. So you can see how this can be computationally challenging. And in addition, the data we observe are never complete. So for example, rank can be missing at random, and assessors can sometimes provide inconsistent preferences. And when it comes to fund voting, each fund owns a different set of companies. So the challenge arising from missing information poses a big challenge. And to tackle this issue, I implement the Metropolis Hastings Markov Chain Monte Carlo algorithm. And this algorithm is developed by, a variation of this algorithm is developed by Vitali and co-authors. And this algorithm handles the issue that I just mentioned. And for the estimation, I use the Bayes-Mallow R package developed by the authors. And here I outline the estimation details, but I won't go over that in detail in the interest of time. Okay, so now I'll show you the data and the estimation output. So the data are from typical sources, and the data sources are summarized in this slide. And for each of the provisions listed in this slide, I implement the algorithm on fund vote and construct mutual funds preference rankings across firms that receive the same type of proposal in the same year. So just to give you an idea of how the estimation output looks like, the graphical version of the output is shown here. So each firm in my sample has its posterior distribution of rank. And because it's a little bit too small to see what is going on here, let me just show you the extreme from both sides. So the figure you see here for Citigroup and Apple, they show that the mean of Citi's posterior rank is 2, and the mean of Apple's posterior rank is 92. So it seems like when it comes to proxy access, funds are more enthusiastic about Citigroup allowing proxy access compared to others, compared to Apple. And now, because the ranking is a new thing, let me now take a step back and put the rankings into a big picture perspective. So if there's a mutual fund that has a strong stance on certain issue, so for example, if a fund has a strong stance on proxy access and always votes for its portfolio company's proxy access proposals, then the fund's observation is not telling us whether one company deserves proxy access more compared to another firm. So the fund's vote won't affect the ranking. And as you will notice, the cross-ownership or common ownership structure is very useful in extracting information, because if a fund has hundreds of firms in its portfolio, then it is likely to vote on many companies' proposals on the same topic and provide relative preferences. And the ranking here captures the consensus among funds. So in some sense, it is similar to the concept of a popular vote. And this doesn't mean that all funds are in an agreement. So different funds can have different preferences, and the ranking in this paper just aggregates those different opinions to measure the sentiment around the vote. And finally, and importantly, I take fund preferences as given, and I start from there, just like many studies that use the revealed preference argument. And the literature has shown that ownership stake, business relationship, and cross-ownership affect voting behavior. And I don't try to disentangle these factors from the ranking at this moment, although I'm keenly interested in examining the drivers of these rankings. And now that I've talked about the construction and the meaning of the rankings, let me now show you how the rankings can be connected to our knowledge. So I'm first going to show you the degree of correlation between rankings and the variables we care about in the literature. And then I'll show you whether active and passive funds have similar or different preferences. So I first explore how company characteristics are correlated with rankings. So to give you some idea of what's been discussed in the literature, one leading view is that companies with more agency problems can benefit more from shifting control to shareholders. So if funds take this into consideration, then they would be more supportive of shareholder proposals at firms with weaker governance. And in a similar manner, one can expect firm performance to matter as well. And recent studies pointed out that takeover protection can be more beneficial for young and small firms compared to large and mature firms. So I explore whether the estimated rankings are correlated with agency proxies, performance measures, size and age. And the estimated rankings, because they are ordinal variables, I estimate the Spearman's rank correlation coefficient between the rankings and the variables of interest. And the results are shown in this heat map. So here, green means positive association, and red means negative association, and vivid color means statistical significance, and pale color means lack of statistical significance. So I'll just try to highlight the key takeaway in the interest of time. So my first takeaway here is that fund rankings are correlated with agency proxies, such as board independence, insider ownership, and abnormal compensation. So in other words, funds are more supportive of proposed governance changes at firms that seem to have weak governance. However, firm performance doesn't seem to matter that much. So the results are weak at best, and the signs often go against the predicted direction. And finally, and perhaps surprisingly, funds are less supportive of proposed governance changes at large and mature firms, not at small and young firms, as the literature would predict. So at this moment, I don't have a crystal clear explanation to this pattern, but one reasonable explanation is that large and mature firms are targeted too much, and funds are voting down those like meritless proposals. And in fact, I find that large and mature firms are much more likely to be targeted by shareholder proposals. And this suggests the possibility that large and mature firms might have been targeted by shareholder proposals at a beyond optimal level. And next, I also examine whether proposals by certain sponsor types are preferred by mutual funds once we fix the topic. So the figure here displays the kernel density estimate of the percentile rank for each sponsor. So I find that mutual funds prefer proposals sponsored by non-SRI funds, but they don't like the proposals sponsored by SRI funds. And another pattern that you notice here is that individuals' proposals are the least favored among all these groups. And this is consistent with literature findings, and that includes the recent work of Nickolay and Maria Cinta, as we all learned about it during Maria Cinta's discussion. And next, given that vote support determines proposal outcomes, and it gives some sense of how investors view the proposals, a natural question is whether the estimated rankings are correlated with vote support. So I find that voting outcomes are moderately correlated with my rankings, and that can be seen from the Spearman's rank correlation coefficient in this slide. So it appears that mutual funds preference rankings and vote support point in the same direction, but the correlation is not too strong, indicating that the two measures provide different information. And another important question is to what extent the results are correlated with proxy advisors' recommendation. So as mentioned earlier during the presentation, proxy advisors recommend whether investors should vote for or against the proposals, and their recommendations are shown to be influential in determining fund voting behavior as well as voting outcomes. So I find that proxy advisors' recommendations are highly correlated with ranks, and this shouldn't be surprising. So specifically, if ISS recommends to vote against a company shareholder proposal, then the company rank is almost always in the bottom pile. And I guess one should be worried if proxy advisors' recommendation explain like all the variation in rank. So I estimated the ranking using a subsample for which the management recommended to vote against, and the two proxy advisors recommended to vote for. And the estimated rank is not uniform across companies in the subsample, and that means that the rankings contain information above and beyond proxy advisors' recommendation. And as a final step, I examined whether active and passive funds have similar rankings. So this touches on the question of whether passive funds vote in an active manner. And the prediction can go in several different directions. And I guess people paying attention to this literature would have priors on this. So I examined the degree of correlation between active and passive funds ranking. And the findings as of now is that active and passive funds have very similar preferences. And I'm trying to explore alternative classification of passive versus active. So the updated results will appear in the next version of the paper. So I think I'm out of time, so let me wrap up. So we all have different beliefs and preferences, and each company is organized and run differently. And this nature might make it seem like it is difficult to make comparisons across companies. I'm proposing that there are ways to do so when we have common owners that express relative preferences. And mutual funds have been criticized for voting one size fits all, and not all of them do. And not all mutual funds always follow proxy advisors' recommendation, even if they subscribe to proxy advisors' voting recommendation. And any deviation is information I can use to make inferences about companies. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I look forward to Nickolay's discussion and the reaction from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene, for your presentation. Now I hand over to Nickolay Gantchev, who has the opportunity and the duty to comment.
Okay, I assume everyone can see my slides. First I wanted to thank the organizers for asking me to discuss in particular this paper. This paper requires quite a bit of reading because it has so many results. And so as Irene said, you can actually take the discussion in many different directions. So for example, we have a new methodological approach. So technically you can spend the whole 20 minutes discussing this approach. But I saw actually Irene present this paper maybe a week ago at a different conference, and she got a lot of good comments on the methodology. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to focus on the empirical contributions to the governance literature, given that we are also in a corporate governance conference. We know from quite a bit of recent work in the finance literature that the way mutual funds vote can affect the governance of firms and ultimately their value. What we still are not quite sure is which of these different explanations matters more. So what exactly determines the decision of a mutual fund to vote for or against a specific proposal? And this is ultimately what the question in the paper is. So very briefly, what we know from prior work is that mutual funds that have larger stakes or have more concentrated stakes tend to collect information, their own information, and in that sense, economic incentives seem to be driving their voting decisions. We also know that mutual funds also tend to follow their own preferences or ideology, which may sometimes actually be contrary or not taking into account the firm-specific circumstances. We also have quite a few papers talking about proxy advisor recommendations. We already saw some of this mentioned before. And the idea here is that proxy advisors may sometimes either be conflicted, but also they may issue blanket recommendations, which ultimately might not be taking into account the particular situation of the firm. And of course, we also know that mutual funds may also be conflicted on their own because they may have some ties with the firms that they actually own in their portfolios. So what is different in this paper is that Irene has a very different tack. She doesn't really focus on any of these more mutual fund characteristics, but on firm characteristics. So the idea is that you would estimate what firm characteristics determine mutual fund voting patterns. And at the start, I want to clarify that if it wasn't clear from her presentation, that the focus will not be on vote support, and it also will not be on market reaction. So we have quite a few papers that are relating firm characteristics to either voting support or the market reaction when the proposal passes. Here, the focus will be on the consensus among mutual funds about which particular governance provision might be better for a particular firm. And so in some sense, the question would be which of the firms that a fund votes on would benefit the most from a specific governance provision. Irene explained quite well the empirical approach, but I thought I should also say something here and a little bit more on the next slide. So the idea here is that we use the revealed preference argument. And so we would focus in this example on a specific proposal. There are 6 in the paper, but let's say declassify a board. And we would focus in a particular year and look at initially one fund, Fund A. And this same fund would vote for the proposal in firm X and against the proposal in firm Y. And so fixing the fund, what Irene does is essentially netting out the preferences of this Fund A in terms of this particular governance provision, which is the classified board. So in this case, it seems that firm X would benefit more from it. And then she relates these preferences to the characteristics of the 2 firms in this case. Now, so far so good, but then the complicated part comes in. Irene needs to aggregate the preferences across the votes of all of the mutual funds in her sample period. And this actually is intended to produce a preference ranking. So essentially, at the end of this, we are getting, if you have a very high preference ranking, that means that a particular provision, like declassifying a board, would be better for that particular firm relative to the other firms that were voted on. And in some sense, this captures the consensus of mutual funds about this particular provision in this particular year. Now, as Irene mentioned, the empirical approach is actually based on a statistical model that has been well accepted in statistics, but not that frequently used in finance. And the bigger problem is that it is difficult to implement on large data sets. And until recently, actually, that was infeasible. Just in passing, Irene mentions a lot of empirical challenges. For example, one that she talks about is numerical overflow, which is essentially the idea that on large data sets it's difficult to implement. We can have missing data. For example, we can have partial rankings instead of full rankings. We can also have non-transitive preferences and so on. But ultimately, what Irene does is introduce a new methodological contribution, which is a new machine learning technique based on the paper that she mentioned by Vitelli et al., 2018. I think this is quite important. And even though in the presentation, it seemed that she spent a lot of time on it, in the paper, I found that it's actually quite rushed. So for example, there are a lot of advantages, but also a lot of shortcomings of this approach. One of the advantages, for example, in this particular setting could be that, for example, her preference rankings are not affected to the same extent by the ownership structure of the firm, which is typically a problem in these settings. But she only mentions this, I believe, in one sentence, and that's all we get. And so I think similar to the discussion that she got in a very different direction from a different person at this other conference, I would say that I think more emphasis should actually be put on the methodological contribution, because it can actually be applied to very different settings. So not just voting, but it can be used also, for example, for buy and sell recommendations. It can also be used, for example, for analyst recommendations and so on. So you can really have very wide use of this approach. Usually in finance, we tend to deal with this type of issue in two ways. The first one is that we would try to push everything in a very long appendix of 100 pages and just refer to it, and very few people would actually look at it. I think the other approach is probably better here, maybe taking this part and separating it with part of the results, which I'll mention on the next slide, and kind of making its own paper. And then that will allow Irene more time to actually focus on what I think are quite a few interesting contributions that she can actually develop further in this particular paper. Okay, so let me now discuss the main findings, but in a slightly different way from how they were presented, kind of incorporating my own views. And the focus here would be to help Irene think about which of these findings are novel to the finance literature and which should or could be developed further. And I have two other ones that I think should be emphasized a lot more on the next few slides. So the first main finding that takes kind of most of the empirical part at the start is this idea that funds tend to vote in a way to address agency problems. So Irene uses a variety of measures to capture agency problems. One of them, let's say, is whether you have an independent board. And so what she finds is that if you have a less independent board, then these firms would benefit more from increased shareholder rights. And similar ways, she can use different measures such as, let's say, managerial ownership, if it's excessive, and things like that. Now, ultimately, the conclusion from these tests is that one size does not fit all in terms of governance. So depending on the level of agency problems that the firm may have, you would basically have potentially vote for more shareholder rights. So this result, I think, is important in the paper because it's used to illustrate the approach, the methodological approach. And in fact, that's partly how Irene uses it. But from a purely corporate governance perspective in contribution to that literature, I didn't find it that new. And I've cited there several papers that essentially in different settings document the same thing. The other thing that I found is that this part of the paper, and I'm saying this in order to be helpful, is a bit repetitive and a little bit long, because the table itself, table 3, is about 10 pages long, and it has about more than 200 regressions in it. So it is actually quite a bit of a hassle to get through it and to get to this conclusion. And as I said, it's actually important for the methodological approach, but what I think should happen is maybe carve it out with the methodology in its own paper, and then spend a bit more time on the other findings, which are actually quite interesting and could be developed further. So the second main finding is that whether funds prefer stronger shareholder rights for larger mature firms. And this comes from actually a long literature that talks about that younger firms or smaller firms maybe actually need stronger management rights. And that's not what Irene finds in this paper, which in some sense it is surprising. But as she mentioned in her presentation, maybe there is some selection issue here, in the sense that the firms that are actually getting these proposals, are targeted with the proposals, are actually large and mature firms to start with, and that has been shown in many papers. And so I think the result is quite interesting, and so maybe focusing a bit more on the selection issue and how it can be addressed can make it even stronger. And then the third main result that I'll mention is this focus on whoever sponsors the proposal. So rather than the firm, we're focusing on the proposal sponsor. And what the paper finds is that the mutual funds prefer, for example, pension funds and non-SRI funds, but they particularly dislike individuals. Obviously, as Maria Sunta outlined in our paper, a quite interesting topic, I think, for us. And I think this could also be developed a little bit further. Now, I want to, I have no idea how much time I have, but I'm going to focus on 2 additional findings that I think need to be emphasized a bit more, and maybe can lead to a very significant contribution if they're developed further. So the first one is this, I want to make the distinction before I get to the finding, is this difference between rankings versus vote support. So rankings, of course, rely on variation between in the pattern of mutual fund voting. So the idea is that you want the mutual fund to vote differently across the portfolio firms, and that's the variation you use. Of course, as Irene mentioned briefly, this relies to a large extent on common mutual fund owners or cross owners, because that's what's used in the calculation of the rankings, and they're equally weighted. Now, vote support is quite different, right? So vote support is based on the views of all investors, not just mutual funds. It's evaluated by the ownership of the firms, and also is impacted to a much larger extent by the ownership structure of the firm. So usually we have issues with that in terms of identification. So now that we know how rankings are different from vote support, probably not surprising is the finding that they're actually just moderately correlated. And I think here Irene has a very unique opportunity to maybe push a little bit further. She already mentioned that maybe she's doing something like that, but to tell us a little bit more about the importance of ownership structure in determining different firms' governance structures, and also in this idea that common owners are important for governance. And maybe she can bring some new insights into this, just having her unique setting in this case. And then one other result that she mentioned, but I think it's relegated to the end of the paper and not emphasized enough, I think, is this distinction between active and passive funds. Now, I think this is quite interesting because on the one hand, based on the data in the paper, passive funds and active funds are more or less equal in terms of determining the findings of the paper, in the sense that from one of the tables, we know that on a given proposal in a given year, we have about 25 passive funds that vote differently across firms and 35 active funds. When Irene separates the rankings and estimates them separately for passive and active funds, a very interesting finding emerges, which is that they actually end up having very similar governance preferences, which I found quite surprising. If anything, actually, the relationship between fund preferences and firm characteristics is actually more pronounced, or you could say driven to a larger extent, by the passive funds. And of course, one explanation here is that passive funds own more stocks, and so there's more variation in the way they vote, and so that determines this result. But there is also other results in the paper that are quite interesting. For example, she finds that passive funds vote less uniformly than active funds, and also they're much less likely to follow ISS than active funds. And usually we use these kind of measures to differentiate active monitors from just passive owners. So I think here is another opportunity where this result could actually be developed further, and maybe so we can see some new insights about the role of passive funds as active monitors, which is a very interesting topic, I think, and only recently has become more popular in finance. So overall, I think it's a very interesting paper with a lot of results. Also a very thought-provoking paper. In some sense, I actually had a lot of questions when I started the paper, and when I finished it, I also had a lot of questions, maybe different questions. So I learned a lot, but also I was left with a lot of new questions, which I think is really the mark of an interesting paper. I think there are quite a few opportunities here and directions in which Irene can take the paper. And I really am looking forward to seeing the next version and how she deals with so many results and how she ultimately decides to develop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nickolay, for your insightful comments. Now, I wonder whether you, Irene, would like to respond directly and offer a couple of thoughts on what you've heard.
Okay, yeah, sounds great. So Nickolay, thank you very much for your great discussion. So your comments will definitely help me revise the paper. And I agree with most of the points you raised. And I'm glad you found that the paper makes a methodological contribution. I've only talked to a handful number of people. Some people would say the paper is doing, like, the paper makes a methodological contribution. And some people would say, I'm only interested in the main results. So go to the main findings. And so I am very glad to hear this comment. And yeah, and then I'm also trying to see what people there are so many things I can do with this paper, with this methodology. And then I'm really trying to see what are the findings that people find interesting and what are the things that people are not finding interesting. So it's actually really great to hear. And regarding your point on active versus passive funds, yes, I think my work is actually at an early stage, even compared to the rest of the paper here. And so I'm trying to really dive into what's going on here. And there are several things that can be driving the distinction between passive and active funds. One can be the number of funds, and one can be whether they have the decision to choose the firms that own. So a lot of things can be going on here, but I'm definitely into investigating more here. So thank you, and all points are well taken. And I'll follow up with you after the conference to make sure I get all your points. And maybe I can now take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
Yeah. That's what we are going to do. Now, my suggestion is as follows. There are two questions by Emilio Catan and Eva Michela. I will read them to you. And in a second round, I see that Ernst Ludwig von Tadden has his hand up, and I will also put a question. So first, the question by Emilio Catan from NYU. Let me read it to you. Irene, how do you handle that proposals with a given rubric, for example, allow shareholders to call special meetings, may differ in their fine print? For example, one proposal may request a 10% threshold, while the other requests a 25% threshold. That's Emiliano's question. And then Eva Michela from LSE has the following question. Thanks for your paper. My understanding was that asset managers frequently vote shares held by different funds managed by them in the same way. What do your data show? Am I right that your data show that asset managers exercise voting rights on a per fund basis?
I'll respond to Emiliano's question first. So here for special meeting, I do not make any distinction, and that's something that I should have checked better. So the reason I examine 40 classification proposal is it's a 1-0 thing, and the firms that receive the proposals have a classified board. So I think firms are uniform before they receive the proposal, and declassification mean the same thing. And I don't examine the ESG topics because the status before the disclosure is different for all firms, and the implementation is also different for each firm. And I think for special meetings, this is somewhere in between. So I should have probably checked it more carefully and do this by the same threshold. So yeah, thanks for the comments. And can you repeat the second question again?
Sure. The second question was this. My understanding, that's what Eva says, was that asset management shares managed by them in the same way. What do your data show? Am I right that your data show that asset managers exercise voting rights on a per fund basis?
So I think this goes to the question of fund versus fund family. So I think I tried to see whether there's any heterogeneity within a fund family. And some funds they always vote in the same way. If there's a Microsoft board declassification proposal, then all funds within the same family would vote in the same manner, but that's not always the case. And in many cases, there's a lot of heterogeneity within a fund family. And so I thought it would make more sense to use fund level vote, and then I think that's a more natural choice for the algorithm I use as well. So yeah, hope I answered your question.
Okay, thanks. Then Ernst Ludwig von Tadden from Mannheim University has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting, Irene. I may have missed that, but just for curiosity, do you have a measure of inconsistency of decisions or preferences? I'm thinking of choices that a given fund faces where the firm and the proposal are very similar. So two different firms and two different proposals, so two different situations, but they are very similar. And the fund decides in one situation this way, and in another situation, in the other situation, another way. So in that sense, I'm asking about whether these revealed preferences that you're taking as the building block of your analysis are in fact consistent with each other in the sense of Samuelson or Higgs. So
are you asking whether really two really similar companies vote is being split, for one firm and against for another firm?
Yeah, so, exactly. So whether you could literally say that a fund that you see funds voting inconsistently in the sense of making opposite decisions in very similar situations.
I see. So yeah, that's something I will have to check. So would you think that similar would imply similar performance, similar size, and things like that?
I mean, obviously, on the one hand, the firms must be similar, so similar performance, similar industry, whatever. And then, of course, Emiliano's concern is valid as well. Are these two proposals indeed very similar, or is defined run differently? So there may be only different situations. In that sense, of course, the notion of the weak axiom of revealed preferences, what is behind my question, doesn't apply. But there may be, in fact, given the multitude of different situations you're having, you may see some degree of inconsistency, which would be quite interesting, because after all, what is behind your analysis is something like a rationality idea. No? So you are assuming these managers make rational decisions. But of course, if they violate the most basic axiom of rational decision making already in the data, then one would want to probably be a little bit careful.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'll have to see in the data. So I will take a closer look at that and then for proposals, like it's special, except for the special meeting proposal, I think most of it is like a 1-0 thing, like for declassification. So I think it wouldn't have any problem. The proposal would be mostly the same, like for the topics I examine. Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Todd Gormley, Washington University of St. Louis.
Great. So first off, I thought it was a super interesting paper. And I really agree with Nick's last comment that pushing on the passive versus active direction, I'm maybe a bit biased here, but I think that would be super interesting. But my question was about the selection issues, and that you briefly mentioned and Nick briefly mentioned in this discussion, and that I was watching the presentation, it just seemed to me like that might be really important in terms of how we interpret the correlations that you're presenting. And so, just basically the fact that different types of firms are going to get these proposals. So I was wondering if you had thought about how that selection issue might be affecting some of the correlations you present, or how correlated are these variables that you're looking at with the likelihood of observing these proposals, if you have any information on that.
So I would have to say that because my results are pairwise correlation at this moment. So I think the selection issue, all kinds of selection issue can change the interpretation. But that being said, I would have to say that large and mature firms are much more likely to be targeted, but it's not the case for other variables that I examine, like abnormal compensation and so on. There's a slight difference, but it's not hugely different. So I think the extent to which selection can affect the results would be different for different variables I examine.
Thanks, Irene. There's a question from Maria Grigoropoulou in the Q&A. Let me read it to you. Do you have an interpretation for mutual funds preferring proposals sponsored by non-SRI funds?
Yeah, so I think there are two different interpretations. So one interpretation is that funds sponsor better proposals, so they are liked by investors, and one of the investors I'm examining is mutual funds. So that's one interpretation. And the other interpretation is that mutual funds just have similar preferences. So they like proposals sponsored by their funds. So yeah, I think both interpretations are possible.
Yeah. Then let me put a question to you, Irene, that opens up the normative dimension, which is not what you're looking at, but nevertheless, I think interesting, at least from a lawyer's perspective. Now, you're finding that funds care about agency costs, but they don't seem to care much about firm performance is surprising, maybe even concerning. And it raises the question why this is so, and also whether one should or could do something about it. Now, in terms of why this is so, has this something to do, that is my question, the first part of my question, potentially with the salience of agency issues, corporate scandals in particular, in the general press and in public discourse compared to other more technical information about firm performance, which doesn't raise the same issues? Is that one explanation, potential explanation? And as far as the other aspect of the question is concerned, what are your thoughts on whether there should be something that should be done about funds not caring about firm performance, And if so, what could be done?
It's an interesting and also a difficult question. So I think salience is definitely like a valid explanation, and it's like more visible. Like if you have like weak governance, then like you can be like media is going to mention that. So I think it's more of a 1-0 thing, and performance is something that is also time varying. And what is the right metric? Is it ROA, 3-year target return, abnormal target return? I explored like all of those things, and then surprisingly didn't find very like strong results that support matters. Firm performance matters for fund voting pattern, and this is like not just my paper. And when I looked at Dennis et al. Like survey paper, like looking at company characteristic and shareholder vote support rate, like they also find a weak negative relationship or like insignificant relationship. So I think it's yeah, and then also I think one thing is like whether you want to punish like something. So firms can try hard and then they can exert effort, but their performance can be bad. So in some sense, like would funds like notice that there's something wrong with the management, and would they think that something is wrong with the management, or are they seeing the effort and just thinking that they happen to have a bad year? So I think it's a bit unclear whether performance should be like measured in one way, and then like it can be used as a punishment device. So yeah, I think and regarding what regulators should do, yeah, again here, like I don't have a clear answer, so I don't know whether it's the right thing to do, like to punish for like a 1-year bad performance. And like, yeah, I hope there's a better way to like measure the performance in a consistent manner. And yeah, so. Okay.
My comment or question has prompted a follow-up from Jeff, and that is the final question that I'm going to put to you. How do your Irene's results, namely performance doesn't matter, fit with apparent prior findings that say on pay votes are driven by performance? Or are these shareholder proposals only? And if so, does that tell us something about negative prior for those proposals anyway?
Yeah, so yeah, I don't have a good way to answer like how that should square with the say on pay vote. So yeah, it's been, I think like compensation and the voting behavior might be a different thing. So executive performance and fund voting behavior, like executive like compensation might be like evaluated differently from like how funds vote on shareholder proposal. So that's one possible explanation, but like I don't have a good way to square those two different findings.